Wizardoms, Legend of Shadowmar by Jeffrey L. Kohanek. Narrated by Travis Baldry. 1. Feeding the Mark. The dice hit the table, tumbling, spinning, settling. Cheers arose, drowning out the groans of the losing bettors. Jarrell grinned, scooped up the dice, and leaned forward, punching Rindle's shoulder. The thin thief winced. With the others distracted, Jarrell held the cup beneath the table, working quickly to replace his weighted dice with the original set, save one. "You had better throw well, Rindle," Jarrell said loudly, his words slightly slurred, making it seem as if he were drunker than he was. "You'll need all sixes to beat me." Jarrell was smart enough to weigh one of his dice to never land on 6. 3 of them always hit. The other 2, well, those were random luck. With his last throw, both had struck. "You must have sold your soul to the Dark Lord, Jarrell," Rindle grumbled. "Nobody has your luck." "Flattery will get you nowhere with me, Rindle." Jarrell grinned broadly, knowing full well what the thief meant. "That wasn't—" Rindle grimaced, snatching the cup from Jarrell. "Give me those blasted dice." The crowd surrounding them began placing side bets. None rivaled the pile of coin on the table. Jarrell had waited until Rindle had won several throws before upping the ante and shifting to his fixed dice. Feeding the mark, the thieves called it. Rindle had never grasped the subtleties of the profession. Cordelia believed he possessed some strong points. Jarrell found it difficult to see them, save for his skill with the rapier. However, dueling was seldom central to a thief's survival. Better to avoid such situations. The dice rattled in the cup. Rindle pressed his lips together, as if he were willing the dice to yield to his demands. Jarrell knew they would not. He had been sure to leave his only off-weighted dice with the others. "I'll double my bet," Jarrell announced. The rattle ceased as Rindle stared at him with narrowed eyes. "Why would I agree to doubling down? The odds are against me." "Listen," Jarrell said in a friendly voice. "I feel bad. I'm currently ahead, and taking this pot will likely drain you of funds. I want to give you a fair chance to win it back." "How so?" Doubt filled Rindle's eyes. "I'll double my bet, and all you need to do to win is not shake a 1. Rindle blinked as he considered the idea, the tug of a smile causing his lip to twitch. Jarrell knew he had him. A poorly resisted smile was Rindle's tell. Everyone had one, even Jarrell. Knowing that, he intentionally displayed numerous tells so nobody could catch on to which was real. "Fine," Rindle grumbled, but Jarrell knew it was feigned anger. When the rattle resumed, Jarrell grasped Rindle's wrist, stopping it. "If I win, you do a shot of swoon." Rindle frowned. "I hate the stuff." "Just one shot," Jarrell shrugged. "Besides, consider the odds. You can win back your 3 gold, take 6 from me, and all you risk is taking a shot." A slow nod from Rindle joined the rattle of the cup. He shook it hard, raising it before dumping the contents. Dice hit the table, tumbled, and spun. When they settled, 3 6s, 2 4s, and a 1 faced upward. Jarrell shook his head and patted Rindle's thin shoulder. "Poor luck for you, Rin." He leaned forward and scooped up the coin while the side bettors exchanged theirs. With his purse now full, Jarrell stood and shook his opponent's shoulder as Rindle stared at the dice. "The game is over. Let's go get your shot. I'm buying." Rindle stood a full head taller than Jarrell. Even so, he was thin as a rail and hardly outweighed Jarrell, who was thin himself, yet possessed enough muscle on his frame to make the difference. When Rindle spun from the table, Jarrell casually scooped up the die with a single dot facing up and slipped it into his pocket. He then followed Rindle through the crowd, toward the bar. The tap room of the Mangy Dog was full, as it was most evenings. A fight had broken out earlier, but was soon over, and the crowd had settled back into their routine. Thieves, paid guards, informants, smugglers, and whores, all members of the Thieves' Guild, frequented the place. Everyone knew Lord Taladane ran Fastella and the rest of Geldor, but Cordelia ran the guild and the underbelly of the city. Here and there, sailors or travelers unknown to Jarrell appeared in the crowd. By the time the night was through, most would become marks. The question was, who might target each of them? Leaning against the bar, Jarrell waved Big Herm down. The man was tall, but his name came from his girth, the diameter occupying most of the space behind the bar. Jarrell wondered how the man didn't knock down the bottles and tankards he came so close to hitting. Herm spotted him and waddled over. "What'll it be, Jarrell?" When Jarrell clapped his hand on Rindle's shoulder, the taller man winced. "Another ale for both of us, and a shot for Rindle. Swoon." Herm snorted. "Rough night, huh?" he asked Rindle. "You have no idea," he moaned. While Herm retrieved the drinks, Jarrell dug a few coppers from his coin purse and slid them across the bar. Herm returned with 2 foam-topped mugs in one hand, a small glass of black liquid in the other. Rindle grabbed the shot glass and stared at it for a few seconds before lifting it to his lips and downing it in one swallow. Slamming the glass back down, Rindle grabbed his tankard and turned toward Jarrell with a soured face. Jarrell laughed. "Don't look so miserable. Most others would consider a free shot as a boon, not a punishment." "You know I don't handle alcohol well, Jarrell," Rindle complained. The grin on his face widened. "Yes, that's what makes it fun." "Jarrell? Jarrell Landish." Turning, Jarrell saw a stranger on the bar stool beside him. Judging by the color of his beard, the man was old, but he couldn't see his face. His hood was up, face in shadow. "You know my name," Jarrell said. "You are the young man Cordelia recommended I seek." "You know Cordelia?" "I have met her." "Why are you looking for me?" "I have a job, one requiring skills I do not possess." Jarrell maintained composure and kept his reaction from showing, but he was instantly curious. "Go on." The old man shook his head. "Not so fast. I hear you are the most skilled, entrepreneur?" A smile appeared in the shadows of the man's hood. "Well said. I heard you are the best in the city. Can you prove such a claim?" Jarrell frowned. "Do you doubt my skills?" "Well," the man shrugged, "some of the stories are a bit outlandish, especially for someone so young. Are you even 20? Bristling, Jarrell replied, "I'll be 21 next lunar tide. As for the stories, most are true or close enough to what actually happened." The man grunted. "You still doubt me?" Jarrell glanced toward Rindle, whose elbows rested on the bar as he stared straight ahead, glassy-eyed. An idea struck. An idea outlandish enough to stir the old man's interest. He turned back to the man and leaned in close. "I am so smooth, I can steal the small clothes right off a man without his notice." A guffaw burst from the old man. "You would do that to your friend?" Jarrell gave Rindle a sidelong look. "In truth, he is more of a business acquaintance. He believes we are rivals. I keep telling him I have yet to find anyone skilled enough to justify the term." The old man nodded. "All right. You pull this off, you get the job." "Done," Jarrell said with a grin. Drawing the small, thin dagger he kept up his right sleeve, he stepped back, watching Rindle, who appeared oblivious. Swoon was strong and had likely gone to his head. It was true, he did not handle alcohol well. Stepping close to block the view from everyone but the old man, Jarrell slid his blade beneath Rindle's belt. With slow, smooth movements, Jarrell sawed at the leather. On the 4th pass, his blade sliced through the belt. His other hand held the waist of Rindle's trousers, keeping them from falling. "He is so thin," Jarrell thought. "No wonder he wears a belt." Rindle did not notice, so Jarrell went in for the kill. Pulling the trousers out enough to get a peek, he found his target. Reaching the knife between Rindle's hip and small clothes, Jarrell drew the blade upward, the tip slicing through the thin fabric. With the cut complete, he withdrew the blade, still holding the waistband of both Rindle's trousers and his small clothes, then slid one hand round to Rindle's other hip and repeated the process. Jarrell slid the blade up his sleeve and turned toward the old man with a smile. With a flourish, he pulled Rindle's small clothes off and held them up. The trousers, without a belt to hold them up, fell to Rindle's ankles. "What?" Rindle tried to back away from the bar, tripping over his trousers. As he fell backward, he twisted to grab hold of a waitress walking past. She stumbled, and he tumbled with her. Rindle lay on top of the woman, his pale arse exposed for all to see. Laughter erupted. He hurriedly tried to climb off the waitress, who fought him, while others chortled heartily. After a brief struggle, Rendell was able to pull his trousers up. He stood, his cheeks red, while his gaze flicked around the room. Embarrassed, he fled, still gripping his trousers to keep them from falling. Jarrell turned toward the old man and held the small clothes out. "Would you like these as a souvenir?" The man shook his head and stopped laughing long enough to say, "No thanks, but the job is yours." 2. The Proposal. After slipping Herm a few coppers, the bartender gave Jarrell a key. The lock could have easily been picked, but they needed privacy, and Herm would make sure Jarrell and the old man remained unbothered. Jarrell cut a path through the crowd, many of the men patting him on the shoulder and commenting on the trick he had pulled on Rendell. News of the stunt would spread and add to Jarrell's legend, something he cultivated with care. The old man followed Jarrell down a narrow corridor, past the kitchen. Inserting the key into the lock of the first door on the left, he opened it and found the lamp and striker hanging from the wall. He tried the striker in a streak of sparks. The second attempt yielded a flame. He lit the lamp and hung it back on the wall before closing and locking the door. The storage room smelled of stale beer and dirt, the latter likely from the open crate of potatoes on the floor. 4 rows of shelves stood at the back of the room, reaching the ceiling. Near the door was a table with 4 chairs. Jarrell sat. The old man took a chair beside him while digging beneath his cloak. Jarrell tensed, ready to draw any of his 4 hidden blades. He frowned when the man pulled out a folded parchment, followed by a quill and a small inkwell. "Do you plan to write me a letter?" Jarrell arched his brow. "Not quite." "You know my name. It hardly seems fair to not share yours." The man pulled his hood back, revealing a short, graying-brown beard and gray hair, cut short at the sides and bald at the top. His eyebrows were almost as long as his beard. "I am Brenshaw Crane, a trader. I travel the world in search of curious items, which I procure for the most demanding of customers." "Nice to meet you, Brenshaw. You already know my name and profession. Enough teasing. Tell me why you sought my assistance." Brenshaw nodded and rolled the parchment out before dipping his pen into the inkwell. Jarrell leaned forward and watched the man's scrolling lines, trying to determine what was transpiring. The lines curved here and there. When Brenshaw wrote the name Festella beside a dot, Jarrell realized it was a map. "Why are you drawing a map? Are you some sort of cartographer?" "Because you cannot see what is in my head. And yes, cartography is among my many skills." A frown crossed Jarrell's face while the man focused on the drawing. "Why do I need a map? Can't you simply describe the nature and terms of the contract?" Brenshaw paused and looked up, his gaze meeting Jarrell's. "Now is a good time to begin." He resumed his map creation. "The contract I offer involves you journeying to the mountains northwest of Festella. There you will find the ruins of an old castle, a place known as Shadowmar. When I say it is old, I mean it existed for centuries before the great cities." Jarrell's eyes narrowed. "If you know where this castle is located, why not go there yourself?" "Because," the man paused from his drawing and gave Jarrell an ominous glare, "the place is a trap." Concern began to outweigh Jarrell's curiosity. "How dangerous is this trap?" "Many men have attempted to breach the fortress to claim the prize it holds. None have survived." "How many have died there?" "Hundreds, perhaps more," Brenshaw said while still making notes on the map. "Why do you believe I can do this alone if hundreds of others have failed?" "You cannot go alone." Jarrell stared at the man, but his expression was wasted. Brenshaw was focused on the map. "I work alone. I'll not find myself dead because of someone else's mistake." Brenshaw stopped writing and set down his pen. "You will need a fighter, a skilled warrior who can face the monster protecting the keep." Jarrell threw his hands into the air. "Monster? First off, there is no such thing. Second, if there were, why wait until now to bring it up?" The old man sat back with a grimace. "Will you stop interrupting me with your questions? If you allow me to tell you the story, you will have the knowledge you require." Mirroring the man, Jarrell sat back and crossed his arms. Brenshaw nodded. "As I said, Shadowmar Castle is very old. When it was used by the living, monsters were common, as were makers, cultivators, and other races. The beast living in the ruins is a creature of magic. Legend says it stands taller than the tallest man, yet it was itself a man at one time. Part of him still may recall his past humanity, but the beast half of him rules his emotions. Stories surrounding Shadowmar suggest a particularly powerful curse turned this man into a monster, binding him to the castle itself. Many years ago, a wizard lord sent an army to storm the fortress and discover its secrets. None returned. You see, the keep sits high on a mountain with a chasm surrounding it on one side, a sheer cliff on the other, leaving only one way to enter. The only way in is across the ruins of a bridge spanning an 800-foot-deep chasm. All that remains of the bridge is a narrow path, too narrow for more than one person to cross at a time. Adding more men only increases the warning for the creature to respond. Many bones are said to litter the distant bottom of the chasm. If you can successfully sneak across, you and the warrior would face the monster. There is slim chance of surviving, even with the warrior's help. Alone, you would assuredly die. Jarrell listened carefully, resisting the urge to interrupt and ask questions. Now, a heavy silence filled the room, so he charged forward and smashed it. Let's say I find a warrior to join me and we defeat this beast. What would we find waiting? Can't I simply sneak past the monster alone and steal what lies inside without its knowledge? I have certainly done my fair share of sneaking in the past. Brenshaw shook his head. Won't work. Others have tried. The interior is laced with traps, hard to find and easy to trigger. Even if you survived the traps, it would undoubtedly alert the beast of your presence. Jarrell frowned in thought. What do you know of these traps? In truth, little, the man said, shrugging. That is where your skills come into play. If not for the risk, I could hire a bodyguard myself and take my chances. Uncrossing his arms, Jarrell began tapping his fingers on the table while he turned the information over in his head. This sounds highly doubtful in nature. Why have I never heard of this Shadowmar? Even if it were true, why would I accept such a mission? If your story is factual, the risk is great. I understand your hesitance, Brenshaw said. This is why I am willing to pay you the sum of 100 gold pieces should you return with the prize. Jarrell gaped. He couldn't have heard correctly. Did you say 100 gold marks? Brenshaw nodded, grinning. Yes, 100. With it, you can pay your warrior companion whatever you wish. Jarrell considered the man's words. 10 gold marks was the most any job had rendered. This single contract would set him up for life. With such wealth, he could surround himself with luxuries for years. What is hidden in this castle? How can any mission be worth such a bounty? The man's expression grew serious. An amulet. Jarrell frowned. An amulet? How can an amulet be worth such a sum? That is something you do not need to know. What you must focus on is reaching the depths of this keep and retrieving it. It is a disc of silver depicting symbols around an 8-pointed star with an eye in the center. Fetch it, bring it to me, and you will receive the coin in return. Jarrell stared at the map, his eyes going to the X in the mountains, the word Shadowmar beside it. The mission sounded too fantastic to be real, a yarn woven to frighten children. He feared it would be a waste of time. What if I get there and find there is no castle, that it's merely another legend created from myth without foundation? Brenshaw reached below the table, his hand returning with a small sack. He dropped it onto the table in front of Jarrell with the distinct clink of coins. 10 gold to pay you for your time. If you journey to Shadowmar and find it nothing but a hoax, return here with the news. Regardless, you keep the gold. Jarrell resisted a grin. 10 gold for having done nothing but making a trip of... He gazed at the map in thought. How far is it? 160 miles. Allowing the grin to finally form on his lips, Jarrell held out his hand. Done. They shook, but he paid little notice. His mind was already forming a plan. 3. Brogan. The sky was clear, filled with stars and the round, bright moon. Most thieves hated clear nights. Jarrell enjoyed them and considered the need to lurk in shadows a challenge. He sat on a sloped, clay-tiled rooftop, leaning against a chimney, his body cloaked in shadow. The house where he perched stood near the outer edge of Fastella, 2 streets from the city wall. In the opposite direction, toward the heart of the city, stood Geld Tower and the palace of Lord Taladane. At the top of the tower, the tallest structure in Fastella, a purple-tinted fire burned, as it always did. Some said it was a spark from the god of the wizardom, Geld. All Jarrell knew was he was forced to spend time each evening praying to the fire, to Lord Taladane, and to Geld. Skipping devotion was possible, which he did often, but offenders received a harsh penalty. A week in a dungeon cell for the first offense, 3 weeks for the second, execution for the third. Thus far, he had not been caught. In fact, the last time he had been caught breaking a law was the first purse he had cut 12 years back. 3 days in a cell had taught him one thing: don't get caught. It was quiet, the hour late. Even many of the tap rooms had closed, but the establishment in the building he watched had not. If Jarrell had learned anything in his 20 years, it was patience. Rushing into things could get a thief killed. It was important to study the mark, gauge the risk, and identify all weaknesses. A street over, a dog howled and barked, likely wishing to be let in. Jarrell didn't own a dog because he wished to avoid the responsibility. Nevertheless, he had names for many of the strays in the city and was quick to offer them scraps whenever possible. Having spent much of his life without a home or family, he felt a kinship toward them. The sound of a door across the street drew his attention. A man stepped outside. After dousing the red-tinted lantern beside the front door, he went back in and closed the door. It wouldn't be long now. A few minutes later, 4 men walked out the front door. One wobbled a bit, and another grasped his arm, steadying him. "Why don't I walk you home, Master Vidlin?" Jarrell recognized Harrod's voice. He and Jarrell were of the same age and had known each other 10 years. Even back then, Harrod had been an imposing lad. Now he was a brute of a man, although none too bright. Jarrell genuinely liked him, despite past differences. Grudges got thieves killed, so Jarrell forgot about the beating Harrod had given him when they were 13, then again at 15 and 16. After all, those acts were only business. Cordelia and her predecessor ran a tight city, and Jarrell eventually realized he had to work for her or leave Fastella. He chose the former. Supporting Vidlin, Harrod walked down the street, heading toward the heart of the city. The other 2 men exchanged quiet words before heading in opposite directions. When the larger of the 2 veered toward the city wall, Jarrell rose and followed. The rooftops of Fastella were as much Jarrell's home as were the city streets. Also known as the Thieves' Pathway, they offered a way to navigate the city without notice. In this case, the height also allowed Jarrell to track his quarry. As expected, the man turned down a dark alley connecting to the next street over. Jarrell knew where the man lived and could have waited there, but the close quarters would have allowed less room for error. Knowing this man, Jarrell might have ended up with a blade through his gut. After crossing the roof, Jarrell reached the eave above the alley. He studied the gloom below, seeing flickers of motion and hearing footsteps indicating the man's location. With the man beyond him, Jarrell lowered himself to a 3rd-story balcony. He climbed over the rail and silently dropped to a narrow ledge, easing along it before leaping for a clothesline. Shimmying along it, the line bent with his weight until he was no more than 8 feet above the ground. He let go and bent his knees with the landing. The man ahead of him spun around, and the distinctive ring of steel loosing from a scabbard echoed in the dark corridor. "Hello, Brogan," Jarrell said as he stood upright. "Come any closer and you'll lose a limb," the big man growled. From the way his shadowy silhouette held the sword, it was clear Brogan Reisner knew how to use it. The man's reputation was the reason behind Jarrell's visit. Jarrell held his hands up. "Easy. It's Jarrell. I am here to talk business." "Landish? Why are you bothering me? I have a job." "Yes, I know." His hand still visible, Jarrell walked closer, lowering his voice. "How much does Cordelia pay you?" A grunt came from the darkness. "Enough to survive." "Don't you wish for more than mere survival?" "There isn't much more for this old soldier than survival. Palin knows how most of my squad couldn't even achieve that much." I have a contract, and I need someone skilled with a blade beside me. Not interested. The man slid his sword into the scabbard, turned, and began to walk away. It's worth 30 gold. Brogan stopped with his back to Jarrell. The job is quick, too. We succeed, and you get 30 gold. Jarrell hoped the number would be enough to entice the man. If we don't, I'll give you 3 gold marks for your time. We don't retrieve the item, you keep the coin. If we do, you get 10 times the reward. Brogan turned back around and crossed his arms. You mentioned retrieving an item. Yes, I can tell you more, but not until you are committed. You want me to commit without any details? You're smarter than that, Landish. He has a point. Fine, I can't give you details, but I will tell you what is involved. The contract is to retrieve an item reported to be held in a ruined fortress in the mountains. You're not gonna believe this. A snort came from the shadows. You'd be surprised by what I might believe. The ruins are supposedly guarded by a giant monster. Surprisingly, the man said, Go on. Brogan's past was largely a mystery to Jarrell, which gnawed at him. The man had a military background, something Jarrell surmised after Brogan had single-handedly slaughtered 4 mercenaries in an attempt on Cordelia's life. Rumor suggested the men had been hired by Larmax, a lieutenant in the Dorban Thieves Guild. 2 years had passed since that event, and nobody had seen the man since. Jarrell guessed he might be tied to a marble block at the bottom of the sea. Such was the price for ambition. Jarrell said, I need your help to face this monster, if it actually exists. There are additional challenges, but I am equipped to handle those. Assuming I can get past them, we retrieve the item and return here with it. What is this item? An amulet. An amulet, Brogan repeated. And what makes this amulet worth so much gold? Well, I don't know, Jarrell admitted. However, the man who hired me gave me the down payment. You can have your share now. Say yes, and it's yours. The alley fell quiet. A dog barked in the distance. Someone shouted at it. The night fell silent once again. I have considered retirement, living a peaceful life away from the deceit and killing. With such wealth, I'd be set for life. Jarrell didn't know the man's age, but judging by his scars, he had led a rough life. Acting as Cordelia's bodyguard carried a great deal of risk, but attacks upon her were rare, occurring less than once a year. The job was already like retirement for a man like Brogan. Anything less would remove him from the game entirely. Cordelia is going to be upset, Jarrell warned. She'll get over it. He smirked. Not at you, at me. Not my problem. So, you're in. I'll take the 3 gold. Jarrell pulled a pouch from his coat and tossed it to land at Brogan's feet. The man bent and scooped it up, his movement nearly imperceptible in the gloom. When do we leave? Give me a day to gather a few necessities. I'll meet you at the North Gate at dawn the day after tomorrow. We aren't walking, are we? Jarrell snorted. Not a chance. I'll have a horse for each of us. You had better. Brogan turned and walked off, fading into the night. 4. Arrogance. The bell tolled, announcing the opening of the city gates. Above, the sky was a pale blue, with a hint of purple at the western horizon. Jarrell rode his spotted gray stallion at an easy pace. Led by the rope he gripped, the chestnut mare he had stolen for Brogan trailed behind. Jarrell was not looking forward to the trip. He had only ridden twice before. The first time was after meeting a merchant's 16-year-old daughter. She had been attracted to his dark, dangerous nature, he to her well-developed physique. The man owned 4 horses, and the girl had taken Jarrell out for some riding lessons. While he had learned the basics of riding, the outing was more a means for the 2 of them to be alone. He liked to think he had taught her at least as much as she had taught him. His second time on a horse was a year later, when a contract required him to steal a prize stallion from a high wizard. Jarrell was not comfortable on a horse, and he knew a weary backside and sore thighs waited in his immediate future. The streets were quiet, people scattered here and there. He emerged in the square outside the gate and slowed, searching for Brogan. A clanking sound drew his attention. Brogan, dressed like a soldier ready for battle, stepped out from the shadows of a building and strode toward Jarrell. Metal plates covered Brogan's chest, shoulders, and thighs, all secured to leather armor. Metal bracers protected his forearms, and he carried a helmet beneath one arm. A simple black cloak trailed behind him, tattered at the bottom from years of wear. In contrast to the worn cloak, his black riding boots were polished and appeared new. Most importantly was the man's battle gear: a long sword resting on one hip, a dagger on the other, and a circular shield strapped to his back. "What took you so long?" Brogan asked. Jarrell's mouth twisted as his irritation from earlier returned. "I ran into a bit of trouble procuring the horses." "You didn't steal them, did you?" The man hefted a pack and slung it over his shoulder. "Well, I'm not paying for horses I plan to use for only a week or two." Brogan paused, glaring at the mare. "I'm not riding that." "What?" Jarrell turned back toward the horse. It appeared long in the tooth, the back drooping. "Why not?" "I'm too heavy." Brogan pointed at the stallion. "Get off. We are switching mounts." Jarrell felt a hot retort on the tip of his tongue, but he held it in as he glared at Brogan. The man glared right back and refused to budge. Finally, Jarrell threw his hands up. "Fine." He slid off and dug through the saddlebag, retrieving a few items he preferred to keep close. By the time he mounted the mare, Brogan was in his saddle and riding toward the open gate. The tall city walls kept the square inside the gate shrouded in shadow. Other travelers, on foot, horseback, and wagons, entered the city through the towering gate, the opening 20 feet tall and almost as wide. The guards at the gate, dressed in plated armor, watched Jarrell and Brogan ride past without challenge. Outside the gate, an arched bridge connected the island city to the north side of the river, the bridge a mirror to the one linking the south gate to the south riverbank. Below the bridge, the calm waters of the Fastella River gently flowed toward the sea. This close to the harbor, the water would be brackish, a mixture of the fresh water flowing from the mountains and the sea northeast of the city. "Where are we headed?" Brogan asked as they crossed the bridge. "Our destination is northwest." The man gave Jarrell a sidelong look, narrowing his scarred eye. "How long will it take to get there?" "I'm not exactly sure," he admitted. "I never actually left Fastella before." "What?" Jarrell's hackles rose. "I happen to love this city." "There is a whole world out there, yet you have seen none of it." Brogan shook his head. "How far?" "My contact said the journey is 160 miles. How long do you think it'll take?" Brogan blew air out in a slow huff. "It's a good thing you got me a horse, otherwise you'd be knocked on your ass about now." "You do know you'd have to catch me first, right?" "Don't go there, boy. You won't like what you find." "I'm not a boy. I'm almost 21. "And you've never left the bosom of your city?" Brogan's tone was mocking. "Why does that matter?" "It matters because I have to travel with you. Did you at least bring water? Purchase food? Do you carry a flint?" Jarrell frowned. "Yes, I have a flint." "And the rest?" "I was focused on the items we'd need once we got there." Brogan reined his horse to a stop. "Those things won't do you any good if you're dead." "Why are you stopping?" Jarrell asked, pulling back on the reins. "I intend to wait here while you go back to buy food and a water skin. In fact, buy 2. Jarrell bristled, pointing a thumb at his chest. "I am in charge of this mission. I'll make the decisions when we stop and where we go. You're only a hired sword." "Listen, boy. I spent enough time in the field to know a soldier can die from lack of water and nourishment as easily as anything else. Dead is dead, be it by a blade or dehydration." Brogan gestured toward the city. "Go on, and don't come back until you have 2 full water skins and enough food to last us both for days." Jarrell glared at the man, wishing Brogan were wrong. Without responding, he turned his horse around and rode back to the city, grumbling beneath his breath the entire time. Angry clouds darkened the sky, matching Jarrell's disposition. His backside was sore, as expected, but he refused to let it show and give Brogan the satisfaction. The day had been long, and nightfall appeared to be coming. It was difficult to be sure, with the approaching storm. To the northwest, streaks of lightning flashed in the distance. After each strike, Jarrell would count the seconds before the sound of thunder reached them. He hoped the storm might slide past, but the count between lightning and thunder continued to dwindle. With each rise they crested, Jarrell eagerly searched for signs of a village or a wayside inn where they could stop. Those hopes repeatedly met with disappointment. By the time he pulled the reins and stopped his horse, the gloom had drastically reduced Jarrell's vision. Brogan slowed to a stop beside him. "The storm will hit soon," Jarrell said. "Yep. We should find shelter." "Seems like a smart idea. You're the leader. What's the plan?" Looking around, Jarrell saw nothing but forest and a narrow trail to one side of the road. He led his horse through the trees until the trail opened to a small glade. Downhill from the meadow was a narrow, bubbling brook. "We will stop here. The horses can drink and eat." Jarrell dismounted and led his horse down to the stream before squatting to refill his 2 water skins. After a moment, Brogan led his horse down to the brook as well. Jarrell wanted to ask for advice, but the idea of giving Brogan added satisfaction made him angry. He hated that the man had been right about the food and water. Having grown up as a thief in a great city, Jarrell was streetwise, knew his environment and the people who frequented it. In Fastella, he seldom faced a situation when he couldn't rely on his own experience. Here, out in the wilderness, Jarrell had to guess at each turn. He hated that. Returning to the glade, the 2 men tethered the horses to a downed tree, giving the mounts enough freedom to move around and munch on the long, yellowed grass. The sky flashed and the ground shook with a deep rumble of thunder. The sky opened up and it began to pour. Jarrell pulled his hood up and fought an inner struggle, one side wishing to ask Brogan for advice, the other despising the very idea. Finally, he asked, "Do you have any suggestions?" The man grunted from somewhere beneath his cloak. "About what?" "The rain." He grunted again. "Since you didn't procure a tent, we have to tough it out. You made it clear. You're the boss. You wanted to camp here. Well, this is going to be a wet night." The rainfall doubled in intensity, coming down so heavily puddles began to pool. Jarrell hated being wet. It rained most of the night. Jarrell watched Brogan and did his best to copy the man. Each sat with his back against a tree, his body covered by a hood and cloak. Whenever Jarrell looked at Brogan, the man appeared to be sleeping, even though he was sitting upright. In the darkness, with the falling rain, it was hard to tell. Even if he were awake, he neither complained nor moved. He simply sat beneath his hood as the rain ran down his armor. Shortly before dawn, the rain finally stopped. When his surroundings began to clear, Jarrell glanced up and noticed the sky growing lighter. He had not slept, and his clothes were soaking wet. He was cold and angry at himself for not knowing enough to bring a tent. A grunt from stiffness slipped out as he rose to his feet. Brogan stirred, the man glancing toward him before he also stood. "Since we're awake, let's get moving," Jarrell said, doing his best to keep his surly mood from seeping into his tone. "If you say so," Brogan said. "When do we eat?" "We can snack on trail rations while we ride." Jarrell used the corner of his wet cloak to wipe the saddle clean. "We'll stop for lunch later." Climbing onto the horse, Jarrell led Brogan out to the trail and they continued on, heading northwest. When they crested a rise, the trees opened to reveal a cluster of 8 buildings beside a small river. Even from a quarter-mile away, the sign in front of one building made it clear it was an inn. Jarrell stared at the village in frustration. "A village! A blazing village!" A grunt came from Brogan. "Stentville." "What?" "The village is called Stentville. You know of it? I have stayed at the inn at least twice." A hot wave of anger boiled in Jarrell's gut. "You knew this was here," he growled. "Yes. And you chose to say nothing." Jarrell's tone was accusatory. "We slept in a downpour without shelter." "That was your choice." "How is this my fault? I didn't know the village was here." Brogan peered toward the village, not meeting Jarrell's glare. "You said it yourself. You are in charge. I'm a hired sword. Since you didn't want my help, I wasn't about to offer it unless you asked. Nicely." Jarrell was cold, wet, and tired. Now anger and frustration piled on top of his poor mood. He wanted to scream. He wanted to stab someone. Mostly, he wanted to kill Brogan. He glared at the man for a long moment before kicking his horse into a gallop, heading toward the waking village. He needed a hot meal and an ale. "Make it 3 ales." Not until the third day, when they were deep in the Gelden Mountains, did Jarrell first pull out the map. He had committed much of it to memory, allowing the image in his head to serve as a guide. It was a skill that came naturally, and he had enhanced the ability with years of practice. Now, if he took a moment to study something, he was able to recall almost every detail. Jarrell glanced back toward Brogan, who stood beside the horses as they grazed on the dead grass at the side of the trail. Removing the map from his jerkin, Jarrell unfolded it and squinted, the pale parchment bright in the afternoon sun. His eyes followed the trail Brenshaw had drawn until it led to the mountain pass where they now stood. Before him, the road split, one route going around the east side of the mountain, the other circling to the west. He paused at the thought of calling the path a road. In truth, it had become a narrow trail, requiring them to ride in single file. They were at elevation, the air chilly and dry. Mountain peaks loomed over them, many with patches of snow on the north face, although it was approaching autumn. The pace had been slow since reaching the foothills the previous morning. Even so, judging by the map, they were approaching Shadowmar. As far as Jarrell could tell, it waited on the north side of the mountain before them. Without clear direction, he thought to try the western route, since it appeared to go uphill. "What do you have there?" Jarrell jumped with a start, turning to find Brogan looking over his shoulder. The bruiser can move quietly when he wants to, he thought, as he stuffed the map back into his jerkin. "Nothing. Funny, it looks like a map to me." Damn it. Jarrell didn't trust Brogan. If the soldier thought he could find the amulet without his help, he might try to kill Jarrell and take the map for himself. Still, denying its existence at this point would only lead to more problems. "Fine. This is a sketch by someone I know. I brought it in case we got lost." "And? And what?" "Oh, we lost." Jarrell grimaced. "Why would we be lost?" Brogan grinned. "Because you haven't used the map until now." Jarrell considered a retort, but Brogan didn't know about his ability to memorize an image, an ability he preferred to keep a secret. "No, we are not lost." "Where are we then?" "We are where we need to be." "Which way do we go?" Jarrell pointed toward the left fork. "That way." "Are you sure?" "Always." The man grunted. "I have had enough of your arrogance, boy. I get it. It's part of your persona and works for your image. I hope that's all it is." Jarrell frowned. "Why do you say that?" "Because when your life is on the line, arrogance will get you killed. Overconfident soldiers don't last long." "What does that mean?" "Pretending to be arrogant is fine, but you need to acknowledge when you're outmatched. In a matter of life and death, an unwillingness to admit you don't know everything can be a fatal flaw." Brogan pointed down the western path. "You say we go that way and act as if your choice to do so is infallible. Are you still so sure?" Jarrell refused to bend. "I am." The man stepped closer until his breastplate was in front of Jarrell's nose, lowering his voice. "If you were wrong, I'll strip you down and leave you without a horse." The man turned and stalked over to his steed, mounted, and rode off while Jarrell watched, unable to determine if the threat were a ruse. As it turned out, the western path did indeed take them higher up the mountain. The going was slow, the trail meandering like a snake, the air growing increasingly colder. The trees thinned until the hillside was covered with dirt, grass, and rock. Still, the peak towered above them. It was nearing nightfall when Jarrell caught his first glimpse of the castle and the rocky peak standing a few hundred feet above it. The structure appeared as if it were carved from the mountain itself. Orange light from the setting sun shone upon crumbling towers and broken walls. At the front, the fallen gate hung by one hinge, the metal rusted. The keep was not massive, but its position upon a small plateau made it highly defensible. Below the plateau was a sheer drop of hundreds of feet. A stone bridge, or what remained of one, ran from the end of the trail to the castle gate. Jarrell rode to the end of the trail and dismounted. He walked to the edge of what remained of the bridge and peered down at the distant bottom of a rocky chasm. The bridge spanned a gap of 100 feet, maybe more. Most of the bridge had collapsed, leaving only one arching wall that had once kept people from tumbling off the side of the bridge. Jarrell heard nothing but the wind whistling through the chasm below. The crunch of rubble informed Jarrell that Brogan now stood behind him. "Do you really believe there is a monster over there?" Jarrell asked. You say it as if you don't believe in monsters." Jarrell turned toward the man with an eyebrow raised. "Do you?" Brogan's gaze never left the castle. "I have seen things, boy. Things that should only exist in stories used to frighten children. This is the sort of place one might find such a monster." He pointed toward the ruins. "Think on this. If the beast is large, it might be trapped, unable to cross what remains of this bridge." He frowned at the bridge. "By Palin, this thing may collapse from our weight." Jarrell considered a giant creature trying to cross the ruined bridge. The man made a solid point. Again, he is smarter than he pretends to be. "Do we try now or wait until tomorrow?" Brogan arched a brow. "Are you asking for my help?" With an eye roll, Jarrell replied, "Yes, fine. I don't know everything. I need your wisdom, old man." "How old do you think I am?" 35? He snorted. "You think 35 is old?" "Well, yeah." "Wait a few years. Your opinion will change." "Fine, you're not old. Now, what do you suggest?" Brogan scowled while staring at the ruins. "It's cold now." The man's breath steamed from his mouth. "It'll only get worse after the sun goes down. I would hate to be out in the open without shelter." "And if the monster is inside?" He shrugged. "It's now or in the morning. I'd rather get through this tonight and get a decent night's rest." "What if we die?" Brogan turned to Jarrell with a grin. "Then we'll definitely be rested." 5. Rear Attack. Jarrell and Brogan led the horses back down the trail until they reached a narrow gap between a massive boulder and the hillside. There, they tied the horses and unloaded the saddlebags. With a coil of rope over one shoulder and a pack over the other, Jarrell was ready. Brogan, choosing to leave his food and water behind, strapped on a helm with a nose guard, then secured his shield to his left arm and added another sword, shorter than the longsword on his other hip. The duo then climbed back to the bridge as the last rays of sunlight faded. Taking a deep breath, Jarrell climbed up onto the wall, the only portion of the bridge remaining intact, and began crossing. The remaining bridge work was no more than a foot wide. The drop below measured in hundreds of feet. Up and over Jarrell went, not pausing until he reached the peak of the arch. There, he glanced back and saw Brogan carefully testing his first step. The wind picked up, buffeting them both. Jarrell fought to maintain balance, waiting for it to calm, praying to Geld it would soon settle. When it did, he continued, moving at a slow, careful pace. A chunk of stone suddenly broke loose, tumbling into the abyss and taking Jarrell with it. In desperation, he threw his body at the bridge. Pain shot through his chest when it struck the stone. Jarrell's hand scrambled to find a purchase, finally doing so on a sharp edge that cut into his fingers. His lower body swung, the momentum nearly causing him to lose his grip. He hung there for a few seconds, his legs kicking at empty air. He began to pull himself up, thankful that a lifetime of climbing buildings had prepared him well. Only after Jarrell heaved a leg over the bridge wall did he exhale in relief. He sat there for a few moments, panting, before looking over his shoulder. Brogan was making slow but steady progress. Jarrell gathered himself and rose to his feet, holding his arms out for balance before he resumed his trek across the chasm. The downhill slope was slow going, Jarrell proceeding more cautiously after his near fall, testing each step before committing. When he neared the far side, he leapt the last 10 feet. He then bent over and rested his hands on his knees while watching Brogan's slow progress. For all the care Jarrell had taken, Brogan was twice as careful. Never did a section give out, nor did he come close to falling. When the man reached the far end, Jarrell had recovered and was ready to advance. He turned toward the battlements and peered beyond the broken gate. Inside was a bailey of sorts, an open plaza of cracked stone tiles with broken statues and fallen pillars. At the far end, the main door to the keep waited. Jarrell wondered what they would find inside. The thought reminded him of the supplies in the pack strapped to his back. He pulled the pack and coil of rope off his shoulders and set them beside the wall. If there were a creature waiting, he didn't want the added weight slowing him down. Brogan eased his sword free, his face grim. Jarrell drew his long dagger from the scabbard on his hip, but kept his other hand free. He could draw his other, smaller knives with speed if needed. "All right," he whispered. "Let's see what's inside." Without a word, Brogan walked toward the gate. Jarrell crept behind him while looking up at the battlements. Shadows began to thicken as night approached. Brogan reached the wall and put his back to it while peering around the corner. He then stepped through and stopped. Jarrell waited outside the gate, staring at the soldier's cloak as the wind ruffled it. When no attack came, Jarrell walked forward and scanned his surroundings. Statues, broken and weathered, stood here and there. A few pillars remained upright, others fallen on their sides. A stone staircase leading to the top of the ramparts stood along the outer wall, the bricks broken and crumbling. Ahead, a short flight of stairs led to a massive set of arched double doors, one of which stood halfway open. Above the keep, towers and windows looked down upon the intruders. The place was eerily quiet, save for the howl of the wind in the chasm behind them. "Where to?" Brogan asked in a hushed voice. Jarrell pointed toward the large, open doors. "That's the way in. Let's go." They advanced slowly, careful to make as little noise as possible. Beneath their boots, shards of decaying stone crumbled to dust, creating a crunching noise Jarrell wished to avoid. With the condition of the place, there was little he or Brogan could do about it. They reached the short, wide staircase. Jarrell scanned the steps, not noticing anything odd. Brogan led him up the stairs and stopped, staring into the dark shadow of the open door. Jarrell leaned close and whispered, "I have a bad feeling about this." The man grunted in return. It appeared to be his favorite method of communicating. Brogan slowly advanced toward the door, his sword extended before him. The tip bit into the old, dark wood. He gave it a shove, and the door opened with a deep, cavernous creak that sent chills down Jarrell's spine. The door stopped. Silence. With a thunderous roar, something tall and hairy burst through the doorway. It swung a huge club, striking Brogan's hastily raised shield. The impact lifted the big man off his feet and sent him flying backward. Jarrell dove aside lest he be taken with him. He rolled with his landing and glanced back to see Brogan land hard on his side at the bottom of the stairs. Scrambling to his feet, Jarrell froze at the sight of the monster of Shadowmar, his mind struggling to comprehend the sight before him. The beast stood 10 feet tall and must have weighed 500 pounds. With the head and legs of a giant bull, it possessed the arms and torso of an extremely powerful man. The creature's thick muscles rippled, its long teeth dripping with drool. It squatted and roared, shaking its head and whipping long trails of spittle from side to side. "A minotaur," Jarrell mumbled, recalling the name from a story he had heard. He always thought such tales to be flights of fantasy, stories meant to entertain and nothing more. Never did he think he would face a creature from one of those tales. The Minotaur lifted a 4-foot-long club and swung it. Jarrell broke from his spell just in time to duck beneath the killing blow. He rolled, stood, and loosed the blade in his hand. Incredibly fast, the monster shifted his club and the dagger tip sunk in, the hilt vibrating on impact. Desperate, Jarrell drew hidden blades from each sleeve and threw. The beast knocked one aside with his club, the other burying itself deep into the creature's chest. The monster bellowed a deep roar before gripping the hilt between 2 fingers, yanking it out, and tossing it aside. Jarrell's eyes grew wide. He had 2 more knives, but they appeared too small to do damage to a beast this size. Without a way to attack or defend himself, he ran. With a bellowing growl, the beast gave chase. Darting down the steps, Jarrell ran to the ones leading to the top of the castle wall and scrambled up them. A massive downward blow from the Minotaur's club missed him by a hair, the wooden shaft smashing into the stairs and sending shards in all directions. Bits of rock pelted Jarrell, the small pieces hitting his legs and back, making him feel like he was on the wrong end of a bee attack. He climbed higher, not stopping until he reached the top, 20 feet up. He turned as the monster threw a massive stone block at him. A desperate dodge enabled Jarrell to avoid being hit as it shattered against the top of the wall. However, his momentum sent him over the wall, his hands catching the edge as his knees slammed into the outer battlements. He looked over his shoulder, toward the chasm below his dangling legs. A crack sounded and a section of the wall gave way, starting a chain reaction. More and more sections fell away, drawing nearer to where he held on. His hands shuffled away from the crumbling wall as his feet scrambled to catch hold of something, anything. The toe of one boot found purchase. He pushed off while pulling himself up and over the edge. He rolled and lay on his back for a beat, catching his breath while considering what to do. Death had come looking for him in the past, and he had always found a way to avoid its touch. To survive this, he needed something bigger than a dagger. He rolled over and pushed himself up, cutting his hand on something. His bloody finger went to his mouth, and a dusty, metallic taste had him spitting and sputtering. Looking down, he found a huge, rusty sword lying beneath dust and debris. Moving aside chunks of rock, he gripped the two-handed hilt and lifted the blade away. The great sword was intact and quite heavy, yet in poor condition after many years of exposure to the elements. Not knowing how deep the rust had penetrated, Jarrell feared the sword would break when he swung it at the beast. However, if he could get close enough to thrust it... Leaning forward, Jarrell peered over the wall and saw Brogan on his feet, facing the Minotaur in the shadowy courtyard. The man darted forward and slashed, nicking the creature's leg before diving aside, barely avoiding a killing blow from the beast's club. Jarrell hurried along the wall and began descending the stairs, doing his best to remain in the shadows as he crept down. The beast roared and swung its club at Brogan. The man ducked behind a tall column. The club struck the cylinder, blasting away a sizable chunk. The column wobbled and tipped, close to crushing Brogan as he ran out from behind it. When Jarrell reached the bottom of the stairs, he caught Brogan's attention with a wave, then held the sword up. The man nodded and ran again, avoiding another crushing blow as Jarrell snuck out into the open. Brogan lashed out with his sword, clipping the monster on the hip. The beast roared in fury, snot blasting from its snout. A stamp of its hooves sent shards of rocks into the air, forcing Brogan to raise his shield. The club followed, and the soldier shifted for a desperate block. With a clang, the club struck the shield and sent the warrior spinning and stumbling backward. He fell to his back. The creature advanced, its club ready. Sensing an opening, Jarrell rushed toward the Minotaur from behind. Without slowing, he readied the great sword like a lance, both hands gripping it beneath the crossguard with the long hilt tucked under his arm and the pommel sticking out behind him. Quickly closing on the monster, he drove the blade home with all his might. While Jarrell was no stranger to a fight, he was a thief by nature, not a swordsman. Given the height of his opponent, the urgent nature of the moment, and the unwieldy size of the greatsword in his grip, his attack lacked grace, precision, or forethought. The result was something he had never considered, but it worked. Just as Jarrell charged the beast, it had leaned over Brogan and roared. The sword struck the beast from behind, with much of the 4-foot blade sliding directly up the Minotaur's rather large arse. A thunderous howl blasted out, the monster jerking sideways, the action knocking Jarrell, who still held the hilt beneath his arm, aside. He stumbled over rubble and rolled across the broken plaza floor. When he came to a stop, he realized he still held the hilt, the blade broken off a foot beyond the crossguard. The monster howled again and dropped its club, its hand going to the broken blade buried deep inside his arse. Brogan rose to his feet, wary. The man's shield was dented, his body covered by cuts and scrapes. His shield arm hung limply, likely broken. In his other hand, he gripped his long sword and advanced. Stumbling as it tried to head back to the keep, the Minotaur fell to one knee. It whimpered, its eyes squeezed shut in pain. Brogan approached it from the side and gave a mighty thrust, plunging his blade deep into the creature's armpit. The beast roared and swiped at Brogan, but the man had withdrawn beyond its reach. He darted back in and kicked hard at the hilt of his sword, the blade still buried deep in the beast. The Minotaur fell to its hands and knees. The insides of its legs were already covered in blood. Then blood began to gush from its mouth. It wobbled and fell, face first, onto a pile of rubble. Jarrell climbed to his feet, wincing. His knees and elbows hurt. His hands were scraped, chest bruised, and a shallow cut ran across his forehead. He limped over to Brogan, the pain in his joints loosening with each step. When Jarrell stopped beside the man, he frowned at the dead creature. "If you had told me yesterday that a minotaur lived in the Gelden Mountains, I would have called you a crazy drunk." The man grunted, rubbing his shoulder. "I have seen a lot in my days, things others would never believe." He turned toward Jarrell with a grin. "However, this is the first time I've witnessed a sword attack up the arse." Jarrell frowned. "I didn't have a lot of options." "So you stuck a rusty, broken blade up the beast's arse?" Brogan's grin only widened. "You should be thanking me. I saved your arse in the process." The man's grin fell away, his tone growing serious. Too serious. "You're right. Thank you for shoving a sword up the monster's arse." Unable to restrain himself, Brogan burst with a guffaw, the action causing him to wince and rub at his injured shoulder. 6. Camaraderie. The sky to the west shone with faint light. The round moon shone in the east, its pale light a guide as Jarrell stepped back through the gate to collect his pack and the coil of rope. After some searching, he had retrieved his throwing knife, the blade still slick with blood. His dagger was nowhere to be found, lost somewhere during the fight with the Minotaur. Losing his favorite knife irritated Jarrell, almost offsetting his relief at surviving the legendary monster's attack. He crossed the plaza, his eyes going to the monster's still form. A sense of fear lingered when he neared the creature, his mind conjuring an image of the thing suddenly rising up and attacking. He then recalled the rusty blade, still buried deep inside the beast. "If it isn't dead, the blade inside it will keep it from creeping about," Jarrell muttered, his breath swirling in the air. Brogan grunted as he sat on the steps before the keep. "Fair point." The man removed his shield and cut off the remainder of his torn cape. With the cloth, he fashioned a sling and slipped his injured arm inside, gritting his teeth while looping the sling over his neck. "I hope there are no other monsters inside. I can still swing a sword, but my ability to fight will be limited for a while." "Well, let's hope there's nothing else living in there then." Jarrell climbed the stairs and peered through the open door. It was dark inside. He rifled through his pack, pulling out a torch, then dug out his flint and striker. It took a few attempts before the torch caught fire. The oil-soaked end flickered and bloomed to life. Jarrell lifted the torch and turned toward the door as Brogan stopped behind him. "No sense in waiting," Brogan said. "The wind is growing colder, so let's get inside." Jarrell stepped through the door, his eyes scanning the floor with each step. The man who drew the map mentioned traps. Deadly traps. "I'll let you go first, then." Jarrell glanced back at the grinning man. "Very thoughtful of you." "It's nothing." Jarrell pushed the door open wider and took in his surroundings. It was some sort of hall with a high ceiling, cracked marble tiles, and little else. The walls to each side stood 30 feet apart, and the hall depth was twice that. To each side of the room were 2 doors, beyond which stairwells ran up from both far corners. In the far wall, between the staircases, was an arched alcove, framing a pair of black doors of the same shape. "That door is open," Brogan said, pointing to his left. Jarrell headed toward the door, watching and testing each step. To his left, a tall, arched window faced the bailey, where they had fought the Minotaur. Beside the window were the tattered rags of an ancient tapestry, dry and frayed. Reaching the open door, he held the torch through, his gaze sweeping the room. It appeared to be a storage room of sorts, with dusty, cobweb-covered shelves and furniture at the far end. The area nearer to the door had been cleared. A pallet lay on the floor, presumably where the monster slept. Near the pallet was a pile of bones stacked in a corner. Amid the bones, skulls stared back at Jarrell. Human skulls. "How many do you think died here?" he asked. "Who knows?" Brogan said near Jarrell's ear as the man leaned over him to peer into the room. "That pile alone contains a few dozen skulls." Jarrell turned and moved to the next door, this one closed. He tested the knob, turning it with care. He then shoved the door open and jumped to the side. Nothing happened. Leaning forward, Jarrell peered into the room, the torchlight chasing shadows to the corners. "Wow," he breathed. "What is it?" Brogan asked. Jarrell stood in the doorway, searching for tripwires or loose tiles, finding nothing. Beyond the doorway, the room was filled with a range of different armor, clothing, weapons, and other gear, randomly thrown into piles. I bet this stuff belonged to the men whose bones are in the other room. Safe bet. Jarrell spotted something of interest and stepped into the room, squatting. He gripped the jewel-encrusted hilt and bit down on the leather sheath, pulling the blade free to examine it in the firelight. The dagger was beautiful and the same size as the one he had lost. The blade and hilt felt well-balanced, and the edge appeared keen. He sped out the sheath and slid the dagger into the one at his hip. Perfect fit. He turned toward Brogan with a grin. One problem solved. Good for you. I doubt the previous owner will miss it. My thought as well. Jarrell slipped past the man. Come on, let's check out the other two rooms. They crossed the hall and opened the first door. Again, no traps or triggers, just a dusty room with empty weapon racks on the walls. Armory, Brogan said. Or it was, long ago. The last door was locked, so Jarrell withdrew his pick set from his inside coat pocket. It was a 2-tumbler lock and took him no more than a few seconds to trip both. Holding the picks in place, he turned the knob and eased the door open. It creaked noisily, the light spilling across the room to reveal a fireplace and some dusty, cobweb-covered furniture. Otherwise, the room appeared clean. This place is cold, Brogan said, even out of the wind. He nodded toward the fireplace. It would be nice to make a fire and rest. Jarrell considered the idea and what lay before them. I am tired and might not be as sharp as I ought to be. If traps are waiting, perhaps they can wait one more night. Brogan grinned. Solid plan, boss. Jarrell rolled his eyes. Enough! I never should have said I was in charge. The man shook his head. No, someone has to be in charge, prepared to take responsibility for the important decisions. His lips pressed together in frustration. Jarrell glared at the man. Then why give me such a hard time? Brogan shrugged. Because you are arrogant and need perspective. Being in charge also means being able to admit you don't know everything and value input from others, especially if they have more experience than you do. So you are saying I only need to ask your advice rather than tell you what to do? The man grinned. You're smarter than you look. Ah. Jarrell turned and kicked the nearest piece of furniture, a wooden chair with padded cushions that may have had color at one time but were now a dull gray. The chair shattered into bits. Wow, I barely kicked the thing. Must be dry rot. It happens over time, and this stuff looks really old. Will it still burn? Yes, hot and fast. We will use it to feed the fire, then. The two men began to break the furniture into pieces and place them into the fireplace. When Jarrell held his torch to the wood, the flames took hold quickly and burned through the wood nearly as fast. They continued to feed the fire over the next hour, using up most of the furniture in the room. The two men then sat on the floor with their backs against the wall and ate trail rations, which were almost gone. Jarrell figured they would sleep the night, then advance in the morning. By afternoon, he and Brogan would either be heading back down the mountain or would be dead. As Jarrell gnawed on a strip of dried beef, Brogan handed him the only water skin they had brought into the keep. The other three waited with the horses. You remember the contract a couple years back? Brogan asked. The one where you rigged the lottery? Jarrell shrugged. Yeah. He was unlikely to forget the largest sum he had ever collected. Yet this job would dwarf the gold Cordelia had paid him then. It was impressive. How did you pull that off? Another shrug bought time as Jarrell considered what to tell the man. I don't like to reveal specifics of a job. He gave Brogan a sidelong smile. Trade secrets, you know. Brogan chuckled. Fair enough. Even so, the added twist of exposing Faldom was pure genius. In truth, I had already drugged Delant. On a lark, I carried him to the man's bed. Good thing, too. The ruckus it caused when they were found together was a distraction I needed to escape. Until then, I considered you just another thief with an inflated head. That job made me realize why Cordelia thinks so highly of your skills. Thanks, I guess. Jarrell thought of his past with Cordelia. It wasn't always that way, you know. There was a time Cordelia had it out for me, but we eventually came to an accommodation. What about Rendell? Jarrell smirked. Rendell is another story. He thinks we are rivals, but he will never be the thief I am. Sure, he can pick a lock and sneak well enough, and his skill with a rapier is impressive, but he lacks creativity. Throw him something unexpected, and he will fumble over himself. As a thief, planning is critical, but skill in handling the unknown is the difference between a great thief and a dead one. The unknown. Brogan repeated the words as if testing how they fit on his tongue. Soldering is the same way. The most thorough planning and brilliant strategies can collapse in a flash if the enemy does something unexpected. Worse, war is chaos. Once a battle starts, you have to adapt and adjust, or you die. Jarrell found himself nodding as Brogan spoke. He had never considered the similarities between combat and his own profession. It sounds as if you know little of what lies ahead, said Brogan. Yeah, the man who hired me mentioned traps, rumored to protect whatever is kept in this place. He glanced around the room, the glow of the low fire giving enough light to make the middle visible while the corners hid in shadow. Rendell would hate it. Both men laughed. It felt comforting to laugh, even if only for a moment. Tomorrow, Jarrell would face a test of life and death, but tonight he would dream of all the things his newfound wealth could buy. 7. Stained Black. Jarrell slept, but not well. Outside, the wind howled all night. Inside, apparitions seemingly appeared in the recesses of the room where he and Brogan slept, or tried to sleep. Jarrell would open his eyes and sit up, the hair on his arms raised, a chill running down his spine. He spent the night in and out of sleep until he became confused as to which was reality and which was nightmare. Disembodied arms broke through the floor, grappling for him, strangling him until he woke, covered in sweat and gasping. The ghosts, if there were any, fled to the shadows and waited for him to drift off again. When he did, they returned, howling for his blood. The process repeated all night, Jarrell catching bits of troubled sleep, followed by a disturbing stretch of sitting awake and unsettled, as if something lingered outside the door, waiting to consume him. When he could no longer stand it, he swallowed his pride and reached out for Brogan. The man's hand clamped on Jarrell's wrist with an iron grip. "It's me," Jarrell said, gritting his teeth until the man released his wrist. "Is it morning already? I feel like we just went to sleep." Jarrell grimaced. "I can't sleep any longer. Let's finish the job so we can leave this place." Brogan sat up. "You feel it too?" Eyes narrowed, Jarrell asked, "Feel what?" "This place. It wants us gone." Jarrell blinked at the comment. "Yeah," he nodded. "That's exactly how it feels." Brogan rose to his feet and adjusted his sling. "Let's do it." Jarrell gathered his pack and rope, slinging both over his head and shoulder before unlocking the door. He opened it, his throat tight, afraid of what waited outside. As it had when they entered, the door emitted a loud creak. Dim light came from the open door at the front of the hall. Outside, the bailey was covered in the purple of twilight from the approaching daylight. All was quiet. Even the howling wind had calmed. Moving quietly, Jarrell crossed the room, heading directly toward the open door at the front of the building. He peered outside and spotted the dark mass of the Minotaur still lying in the same position. A small piece of him feared it might somehow come back to life. He then recalled the 3 feet of rusty steel still stuck in the beast's backside. If it isn't dead, it'll have a difficult time moving around. He turned and found Brogan watching him from across the dark room. "I wanted to make sure it was still dead." The man grunted. "Dead is dead. Things rarely go from dead to not dead." Jarrell walked back across the room. "Rarely? I told you, I have seen things." Stopping beside him, Jarrell asked, "We fought a monster, a creature of legend, yet you didn't seem fazed by it." Brogan shrugged. "I served 7 years in the Murguard." Jarrell had heard of the Murguard, soldiers stationed outside the Fractured Lands. Somewhere beyond those fissures lay the Merlins. Most tales about creatures of legend mentioned the Merlins. Jarrell had always considered them myths. Now, he was not so sure. Shaking the thought from his head, Jarrell returned to the room where they had slept and knelt beside the fireplace. He blew hard and stirred the coals, watching them glow brighter and brighter. Digging through his pack, he drew out a pair of leather gloves and slipped them on. He then dug out the second of his 3 torches and shoved the end into the coals, blowing until it took flame. When he returned to the hall, he found Brogan standing before the alcove at the rear, staring at the tall, arched double doors. Treasure waited somewhere beyond those black doors. Jarrell walked past the man and climbed the 3 steps before the alcove, stopping at the top step, the torch held high. The alcove walls and arched ceiling were made of irregular-shaped bricks, fitting together imprecisely and leaving dark gaps in between. He imagined oversized, deadly spiders and insects waiting in those gaps. As the thought struck him, a millipede crawled out of one. The sinuous creature was a foot long, its body black and shiny in the torchlight. The millipede scurried across the rock and faded into another recess. Shifting his focus to the floor, Jarrell noticed it was blackened. He knelt for a closer look, frowning at the blotchy, stained area between him and the doors. "Blood," Brogan said. "What?" "Blood on stone turns black over time. I've seen it before. The fissures where we fought, some were blackened with blood stains for miles." Considering the size of the dark stain, the blood must have come from numerous men, perhaps over many years. That alone was a warning. He stood and held the torch high as he examined the rest of the alcove. The doors were tall, 10 feet at the arch. Stained black, the wooden panels were lined by a grid of metal studs. The doors conveyed an ominous image. Unlike the rest of the rock, the rectangular cut bricks of the door frame fit together perfectly to form the arch. Text was etched into the brick. Moving closer, Jarrell squinted at the scrawling symbols but was unable to decipher the message. The language was unfamiliar, but it felt like a warning. "Beware," Brogan said from behind him. He continued in a halting stutter. "He who enters with no right to pass shall die." Jarrell turned toward him. "You can read this?" "I learnt a bit of Hasakani when I was on the front." "Hasakani," Jarrell said, turning to look back at the message. "What's a Hasakani message doing in a Gelden fortress?" "I can't tell you that, but the text is a warning, even if I'm wrong with the interpretation. He who enters with no right to pass shall die." The words played back in Jarrell's mind as he examined the doors. The one on the right had a knob. The one on the left did not. Crouching, he held the torch near the doorknob and examined it. Something felt off, but he needed to inspect the knob to determine what bothered him. The handle was made of one solid piece of brass, with no seams, as if cast to appear like a doorknob rather than actually function as one. He put his hand on the door. Solid. He knocked on the nearest panel. Solid. Moving around, he knocked on the others, all feeling the same. Shifting to the left door, he knocked on the upper right panel. Solid. He knocked on the lower right panel. A deep echo followed the rap of his knuckles. He knocked again to be sure. "Sounds hollow," Brogan said. "Shh." Jarrell felt the edges of the panel and found a small recess at the bottom. He fit 2 fingertips into the recess and lifted. After a bit of resistance, the panel popped free and fell to the floor with a clatter. Jarrell looked into the gap, seeing a brass handle attached to 2 rods. He gripped the handle and turned. It held fast. "Here." He held the torch toward Brogan. "Hold this." Gripping it with both hands, he tried again, straining. It moved a quarter turn. He took a breath and tried again. It moved another quarter turn, drawing one rod up, the other down. "Stand back," Jarrell said as he rose to a standing position and braced his hands against the door, shoving hard. He leapt back and to the side. The door swung open, creaking mightily against the ancient hinges. Darkness lay beyond the door. "What did you think would happen?" Brogan asked. "I don't know. Bad stuff, I guess." Jarrell waved him forward. "Bring the torch." When the light entered the opening, it revealed an odd metal contraption connected to the door with the false handle. Jarrell's eyes followed the linkage and noticed a heavy block of granite hanging 6 feet in the air, attached to a chain. Pulling the handle would release the block, which acted as a counterweight. Following the chain, Jarrell discovered a hinged metal rack with dozens of metal spikes, each 8 feet long and an inch in diameter. He imagined pulling the handle and having those spikes thrust through the gaps in the wall outside the door. He suddenly realized why the floor was stained with blood. "It seems anyone who uses the handle gets a surprise." Brogan grunted. "Good thing you didn't try it then." Jarrell gave the man a wry look. "Thanks." He noticed a torch in a sconce on the wall and pulled it free before turning toward Brogan. Touching one torch to the other, Jarrell waited until the one he held flared to life. The added light filled the corridor, extending his view. The tunnel appeared to be carved from the mountain itself, a dozen feet across and just as tall. At the edge of where the light reached was a staircase, rising into darkness. Squatting, he scrutinized the milky appearance of the smooth floor. He drew in a deep breath and blew hard. A puff of dust swirled in the air, forcing him to cover his mouth and nose. It seemed nobody had been down this tunnel for many years, perhaps centuries. Standing, he turned toward Brogan, who still stood in the doorway, torch in hand. The man's left arm was cradled in the handcrafted sling, unusable. Jarrell preferred to work alone anyway. "You should wait while I investigate," Jarrell said. "I see no tracks down this tunnel, so it's doubtful anything lives in here." The man frowned. "You think I'll be more of a burden than a help?" "Well," Brogan shook his head. "No, it's true. You going alone makes more sense than having to worry about me as well." Jarrell stared at the man for a moment before nodding. "I'm glad you see it that way. Keep the torch. I plan to be back before it burns out." He turned and walked toward the stairs. "And if you're not?" Jarrell paused and spoke over his shoulder. "If I'm not back by midday, assume the worst. What you do after that is up to you. Just don't leave before then." Without another word, he resumed his advance, his eyes roving for signs of trouble with each hesitant step. He reached the foot of the stairs and glanced back. Brogan was gone, leaving only a pale light coming through the open door. In a crouch, Jarrell studied the stairs. Each appeared to be carved from the mountain, solid and seamless. He stepped onto the first one, then the next, ascending with caution. 8. Treasure. 142. The number of stairs Jarrell counted before he reached the top. The tunnel remained wide and tall enough that even the Minotaur could have walked around without ducking. Jarrell wondered if the monster had ever ventured into this part of the keep. He knelt and ran a finger across the rocky, dusty floor, leaving a dark streak where he exposed the stone. It had probably been centuries since anyone passed this way. He was unsure if he should consider that positive or troubling, perhaps both. 50 feet ahead, the tunnel rounded a bend. He held the torch behind him, his body blocking the light and casting a long shadow. As he suspected, pale light lit the tunnel somewhere beyond the bend. Jarrell advanced cautiously, listening after every step. Making noise likely wouldn't matter, but he felt more comfortable being quiet. Noise was seldom helpful in his profession. As he rounded the bend, the light ahead grew brighter and brighter until he found the source. The pale light of early morning filtered down to illuminate the rock pile blocking the tunnel. He drew closer and realized that a portion of the tunnel had collapsed. Through the opening, he saw a narrow crevice rising 50 feet above with a slice of morning sky visible. Torch still in hand, Jarrell climbed the debris. Rocks at the top blocked his advance, so he found a gap to one side and wedged the torch in it in order to free his hands. He then began pulling chunks of rock off the top, tossing them to the tunnel floor. When the rocks were too heavy to pull off, he pushed them down the other side. The entire time, he was thankful for the leather gloves. 15 minutes later, covered in dust and sweat, Jarrell fetched the torch and crawled through the narrow gap he had created. It was tight, forcing him to wriggle on his stomach in one spot. When he reached the back of the rock pile, he breathed a sigh of relief and climbed down. He patted the dust off his coat and breeches before resuming his advance. After turning another bend, the tunnel opened to a chamber. Jarrell stopped inside the mouth of the tunnel and gaped at his surroundings. The circular chamber was 100 feet across, the ceiling a high dome, the walls carved from the mountain, just like the tunnel. An ornate mosaic pattern, made from colored tiles of various shapes and sizes, had been laid out on the floor. At the heart of the mosaic, a closed chest sat on a pedestal. Jarrell studied the mosaic. It was in the shape of a creature of legend, an 8-headed dragon. Its body was black, but each of the 8 heads was a different color. The long, sinuous necks of each head surrounded the pedestal in the center, as if protecting the treasure. A haunting song arose in Jarrell's ears, calling to him, drawing him toward the chest. He lifted his foot to step inside the room and stopped, recalling the spikes at the door. It can't be this easy, he thought. Turning, he backtracked to the rock pile and retrieved a chunk twice the size of his own fist. He then returned to the cavern. With an underhand toss, he threw the stone. It hit the blue tiles of one of the dragon heads. Spouts of flame burst up from the floor, dozens of them, lighting the cavern in a fiery roar. Jarrell fell backward from the heat, covering his face. When he lowered his hand, the flames were gone, but the heat of their memory remained. A frown twisted his face as he considered what he had seen. Another rock, he thought, and hurried back to the rock pile. Returning to the chamber, he tossed it onto the dark tiles between the creature's necks. The chunk hit the floor and rolled, stopping shy of one of the heads. Nothing. He grabbed 2 more rocks and tried again. The first landed on the red dragon head and fire erupted. The second landed in the pale tiles between the monster's tail and back. Nothing. Jarrell grinned. He knew what to do. He circled the dragon mosaic until he reached the backside. With a prayer to Geld, he leapt and landed on the pale tile between the dragon's tail and neck. Nothing happened. He advanced toward the center of the room, careful to avoid the colored tiles. Upon reaching one of the long dragon necks, he jumped over it, landing with 1 foot in a narrow strip of pale tile before another leap brought him to the pale tiles encircling the pedestal. Exhaling, Jarrell grinned. He had reached the middle. It was time to focus on the chest. Made of wood and brass turned green with age, the chest was too large for him to carry. He put a hand on the lid and tried to open it, but it held fast. He set the torch on the corner of the pedestal and dug into his coat pocket to grab his lockpicks. The lock proved to be difficult, the tumblers inside requiring extra effort, likely the result of the same corrosion on the brass. When he tripped the 3rd tumbler, he pocketed his lockpicks and lifted the lid. The contents brought a grin to his face. As Brenshaw had told him, there was indeed an amulet, which sat on top of a pile of gold and jewels. Moving with care and holding his breath, Jarrell reached in and withdrew the amulet. Nothing happened. He examined it in the light and found an 8-pointed star, a different symbol inside each point, and a closed eye in the center. Scrawling script he couldn't read encircled the disk. Enchanted, he thought. Valuable. He now understood why Brenshaw wanted it. He slipped the amulet into his inside coat pocket and gazed into the chest. A corner of a folded parchment was visible. Curious, Jarrell pinched the parchment and pulled it free, the gold in the chest clinking as he did so. When he unfolded it, he discovered a map. The region depicted was unfamiliar, the notations in a language he didn't understand. He slid the map into his coat and focused on the remaining items. Coins and jewels, gleaming in the torchlight, filled the chest. An item on top drew Jarrell's attention. A bracelet as wide as shackles, made of gold with tiny crystals along the edges. Opening the bracelet, he spotted the familiar silvery script of an enchantment on the inside. The bracelet joined the goods stored in his pack. The coins and gems still glimmered in the torchlight, begging him to take more. He stared at the treasure and imagined all the things he could buy, the power such wealth might bring. Before he knew what was happening, he dug into the chest. When he lifted out a handful of gold and jewels, he heard a grinding noise. The pedestal shook, rising a few inches. A larger, deeper grinding noise echoed throughout the chamber, causing the floor beneath his feet to shake. Jarrell hastily dropped the handful back into the chest, hoping to stop whatever was happening. It didn't work. Panels opened near the top of the dome, and water began to gush down. His eyes grew wide, his heart racing as he realized the trouble he had brought upon himself. Water rushed in, pooling around his feet and rising rapidly. Driven by fear and the need for self-preservation, he ran, leaving the torch behind. Spouts of fire blasted through the water, to his left, his right, behind him. He reached the tunnel mouth, water continuing to rush in. By the time he reached the rock pile, it was above his knees. More grinding came from the chamber, and the water increased from a rush to a roar. Jarrell scrambled up the debris, then squeezed through the gap, his chest scraping against the tight opening. Darkness loomed, along with a shimmer of water seeping through the mound. The oncoming torrent would likely sweep the entire pile away. The image of water and rock rushing down the stairs and crushing him flashed through his head. That route was a death sentence. Rather than going down the dark tunnel, he reached up into the fissure, got a solid hold on the rock, and began to climb toward daylight. The moment he drew his feet up and into the crevice, a tidal wave struck, splashing water upward, drenching him and almost causing him to fall. He held fast against the flow as it pushed and pulled at him. Slowly, the water receded. He glanced down at the river flowing past, the rock pile now swept away. Jarrell resumed his climb, moving upward at a steady rate. It reminded him of the time he had climbed up a chimney, although this event would not leave him black from head to toe. A few minutes later, he reached the opening at the top and climbed out. The harsh, bitter wind against his soaked clothing had him shivering. He rose to his feet and looked around. To one side was a small lake, the mountain peak towering above it. The lake is draining into the tunnel, Jarrell realized. He turned and began to work his way across the barren, rocky surface. After a few hundred feet, he approached a cliff and peered down. The castle sat below him. A river of water flowed out the front door, filling the courtyard where he and Brogan had faced the Minotaur. He looked around, relieved when he spotted someone moving on top of the fortress wall. "Brogan!" Jarrell shouted. The man looked up, spotting him. "What are you doing up there?" "I ran into a bit of trouble," Jarrell yelled, taking the coil of rope off his shoulder. "I'll be down in a bit." He tied one end to a boulder jutting up above the rest before tossing the rope over the edge. The far end landed on one of the exposed upper towers. After ensuring his pack was firmly secured over his shoulder, he began to climb down. 9. A new level. The ride back to Festella was far more pleasant than the ride out. Jarrell and Brogan stayed at inns for 2 of the 3 nights, both thankful for hot food and a warm bed. Jarrell happily paid for each stay. He would no longer have to worry about money. While he allowed Brogan to look at the amulet, Jarrell said nothing of the map and bracelet he had procured. He figured those were rewards for the added risk he had taken by raiding the treasure chamber alone while Brogan waited. As it neared sunset on the 8th day of their quest, Jarrell and Brogan rode through the gates of Festella. Jarrell led them both to an inn named the Thirsty Goat. It was a place Jarrell did not often visit, which made it ideal and certainly better than returning to his own apartment. He didn't trust Brenshaw, and the man might know where Jarrell lived. Until he was paid, the amulet was his only leverage. After a warm meal and a quick bath, Jarrell left in search of Brenshaw. By then, darkness had settled upon the city, save for the round, bright moon. He headed toward the outer wall, thinking to find the man at the Mangy Dog. When he was halfway to his destination, the tower at the center of town lit up with a bright purple flame. Beams of purple-hued light flashed across the sky, connecting the tower to flame-topped obelisks in each of the major cities in Gelder. People on the streets stopped and knelt. With a sigh, Jarrell did the same, joining others in a chant heard across the city. "Bless us, Geld. Guide us in your wisdom. Protect us from harm, and grant Lord Taladane with your power so he might lead us to a better tomorrow." Jarrell soon lost focus, the chant coming as if it were second nature. The words were the same every evening. While Jarrell typically avoided devotion, he found an odd sense of peace in the chant, allowing his mind to focus elsewhere. Some of his best ideas had come during devotion. For over 10 minutes, he and the rest of the populace repeated the phrase. When the flame in the tower receded and the beams of light faded, the chant stopped. He stood and resumed his journey. The hum of chatter reached Jarrell even before his eyes fell upon his destination. He stepped onto the porch and entered the Mangy Dog, the hum turning to a low roar as he stepped inside. Mixed odors of unwashed bodies and stale beer greeted him, both unpleasant and comforting at the same time. It felt soothing to be someplace familiar after a trip away from the city. At the same time, the journey had opened Jarrell to new things, kindling a longing to discover what else the outside world might offer. He pushed through the crowd, his head on a swivel. The game of dice in the corner drew his attention. With effort, he forced himself past the table and toward the bar. As he hoped, Brenshaw sat on the very same stool as when Jarrell had first met him. He stepped up to the bar, leaning on it with both elbows while sliding a copper coin across it. Without a word, Herm scooped up the copper and returned a minute later with a mug of ale. Jarrell lifted the mug and took a long drink, relishing the cool, bubbly liquid as it slid down his throat. Even the bitter aftertaste was a joy. It had been too long since his last mug of ale. He then turned toward Brenshaw, who was in conversation with a man sitting at the bar, and tapped his shoulder. Brenshaw turned toward Jarrell. His brows rose in surprise. "You have returned!" Brenshaw looked Jarrell up and down. "Alive, I see." "Very much alive," Jarrell said. "Was your quest a success? Do you have the item?" He grinned. "I do." Brenshaw rubbed his palms together. "Let's go to the back room. I wish to see it." "Oh, no," Jarrell shook his head. "Not until I see my gold." The man's face darkened. "I don't have it with me. It's not safe to carry that kind of coin." "The very same reason I don't have the item with me." Brenshaw stared at Jarrell for a long moment before nodding. "All right. Where and when?" "Tomorrow, an hour after the gates open. There's a copse of trees on the west side of the road, beyond the north bridge. Meet me there with the payment, and I'll give you the amulet." Another pause before Brenshaw nodded again. "Very well." Jarrell downed the rest of his ale and slammed his tankard down. "I'll see you there." After exiting the tap room, he moved briskly to ensure neither Brenshaw nor anyone else could follow. He headed down the street and turned at the first alley. The moment he turned the corner, he darted ahead and scaled a downspout as he headed up to the roof. Jarrell ran across the rooftops, hurrying yet remaining quiet. When he reached the roof's edge, he peered over just as Brenshaw exited the inn and hurried down the street. Jarrell shadowed him from the rooftop, determined to see where the man was headed. The sun hid behind clouds to the east, a cool breeze blowing through the trees. Jarrell paced, eager for his gold. He waited in a small clearing as the breeze periodically snatched wilting leaves from the surrounding trees. Winter was fast approaching, and rain with it. Farther south in Palinar, snow would soon cover the ground. Other than his recent trip to the mountains, Jarrell had never seen snow. What other curiosities waited for him in the wider world? A thudding rhythm arose, the sound of approaching horses. Moments later, Brenshaw crested the bridge, trailed by two other riders. Jarrell had considered demanding he come alone, but it would have merely alerted the man to his suspicions. As they reached the trees, Brenshaw and the others slowed. The men with him were armed, one with a sword at his hip, the other with a bow over his shoulder. His horse moving at a walk, Brenshaw rode off the road and into the clearing where Jarrell waited. "What's with the guards?" Jarrell asked in a loud voice. "Surely you can't expect me to carry this much money without protection." "Fair enough," Jarrell said with a nod. "You have the amulet?" "I do." "Let's see it." "Sure, once you show me my coin." With a frown, Brenshaw reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a heavy sack. He set it on his saddle horn and pulled another from the opposite saddlebag. "That's 100 gold." "90, less the 10 I gave you before the job." Jarrell reached into his coat and pulled out the amulet. He glanced down at it, his brow furrowed. "Why is this amulet so important anyway? I know the thing is enchanted, but I can't figure out what it does." A cloud came over Brenshaw's face. "That is none of your worry. Give it to me." Jarrell strode forward, holding out the amulet. With eagerness in his eyes, Brenshaw reached out and took it. He examined it for a moment. "It exists. The Eye of Obscurance truly exists," he whispered, his eyes filled with wonder. "Oberon and the guild will be pleased." With a furrowed brow, Jarrell asked, "Who's Oberon? What guild?" "Sorry, our business has concluded." Brenshaw slipped the amulet into his coat and raised his voice. "Kill him!" The archer slid the bow off his shoulder and the swordsman drew his blade. "I wouldn't listen to him if I were you," a gravelly voice boomed. Brogan stepped out of the trees, dressed in full armor, a sword at his hip. In each of his hands was a loaded crossbow, both leveled at the guards. Brenshaw frowned at Jarrell. "You didn't come alone?" "Neither did you." Jarrell gestured at the man. "The gold, toss it over." Looking none too happy, Brenshaw threw the bags at Jarrell's feet. He squatted and opened one, peeking inside. Yellow coins glittered back. He opened the other sack and found the same. Leaving the bags by his feet to keep his hands free, he stood. "It was nice doing business with you." He shooed the man away. "I'm feeling generous, so I'll let you live. Don't show your face around me again, or I might reconsider." Brenshaw gave Jarrell one last glare before turning and riding away, his guards following. Brogan lowered the crossbows and turned to Jarrell with a raised brow. 100 gold. Jarrell shrugged. "Yeah, I told you it was the job of a lifetime. You only promised me 30. It was my contract. Besides, I took more risks. Did you separate your shoulder?" "No." Brogan turned the crossbows toward Jarrell. "I want half." He grimaced. "Is that how you treat a partner?" Lowering the weapons, Brogan shrugged. "Doesn't matter. I don't need these to kill you." He placed a hand to his chest, feigning hurt. "You would kill me after all we have been through?" The man tilted his head, his gaze distant. "No, I would only beat the snot out of you." A grin split his face. "Perhaps shove something up your arse." The tension broke when Jarrell chuckled. "Fine, I'll give you half." He bent and grabbed a bag, holding it toward Brogan. It was heavy. So much gold. Brogan accepted the sack, hefting it in his palm. "Solid. I never thought I would hold this much wealth in my lifetime." "What will you do with it?" "Like I said, I plan to retire. I'll leave Fastella, head back to Palinar, and find myself a little cabin in the woods to live my life in peace." Jarrell's brows arched in surprise. "That sounds dreadfully boring." Brogan snorted. "Boring sounds pleasant after what I have seen. Cordelia won't be happy. She will get over it. I suspect she has already found my replacement." Brogan gave Jarrell a sidelong look. "What of you? So much money at your age, you could do just about anything." Jarrell gazed at the heavy sack and considered the question. He had experienced little of the world and now believed there was much to see. "I will leave Fastella. It's time to reshape my life into something else." "Cordelia won't be happy about that either." Jarrell shrugged. "She will live. However, it will be difficult for her to replace me." Brogan chuckled. "You are so cocksure, for a runt." "I'm the best thief in Fastella, but it's time to take my game to a new level." Jarrell grinned. "The legend of Jarrell Landish will one day be known across the 8 Wizardoms." From the author. I hope you enjoyed this short story about Jarrell and Brogan. They are both fun characters to write, and they play significant roles in my new epic fantasy series, Fate of Wizardoms. Eye of Obscurance, the first book in the series, releases worldwide on October 1st, 2019. In fact, you can expect the first 3 Fate of Wizardoms books to release before the end of 2019, with more coming in 2020. I hope you will join me on this epic new adventure. Best wishes, Jeff Kohanek. This has been Wizardoms, Legend of Shadowmar by Jeffrey L. Kohanek. Narrated by Travis Baldry. Copyright 2019 by Fallbrandt Press. Production copyright 2019 by Fallbrandt Press.